Hello, everyone. Today, I am presenting an anthropological analysis of gender variation in global cultures, focusing on the Muxe identity found in Oaxaca, Mexico, and comparing it with the Hira of South Asia and the Fa'afafine of Samoa. I will do so through the lens of cultural anthropology, while also clarifying that biologically, human beings are male or female. This is an observable scientific fact rooted in anatomy, chromosomes, and reproductive function. While some societies classify individuals into culturally constructed roles beyond the male-female binary, these are not separate sexes or genders in any biological sense. So let's begin with the Muxes. In Zapotec communities in the Istthmus of Tehuantepec, Muxes are biological males who adopt behaviors, appearances, and social roles that their culture associates with women. From an emic perspective, that is, how people inside the culture interpret it, Muxes are often described as a third gender. However, from an ethic or outsider's viewpoint grounded in biology, these are males participating in gender expressions that differ from typical male roles. Within their indigenous microculture, Muxes may be respected for their roles in family care, crafts, or religious festivities. But outside that microculture, particularly in broader Mexican society, which is influenced by Catholicism and traditional values, Muxes face stigmatization. This tension between local tolerance and wider rejection highlights cultural relativism, the anthropological principle of interpreting behaviors within the values of the culture being studied. However, understanding a cultural system does not require affirming that its internal beliefs are scientifically accurate. No. Moving to South Asia, the Higras are also biological males, sometimes castrated, who assume feminine roles and dress. Their history goes back centuries, and they are even referenced in sacred Hindu texts. In some contexts, they hold ritual roles in weddings or births, reflecting symbolic anthropological functions. But in everyday life, they're often marginalized, despite India officially recognizing them as a third gender. For legal purposes, this classification is culturally constructed, not biologically grounded. Hiras face high levels of poverty and violence, illustrating how social stratification and colonial legacy have influenced their position in society. Now, let's examine the Fa'afafine in Samoa. All right. Again, these are also biological males who take on roles that in their society are associated with caregiving, family support, and sometimes femininity. Unlike in South Asia, however, Samoan society often integrates Fa'afafine into family life with little stigma. This can be explained by the bilateral kinship structure and more flexible gender norms found in Polynesian cultures. The key takeaway here is that gender roles are constructed, while sex is not. A foundational distinction in anthropology between biological determinism and cultural constructionism. Some anthropologists operate from a symbolic or interpretativist framework, trying to understand what these roles mean to the people within the culture. But even in doing so, it is critical to distinguish cultural levels from biological categories. Just because a society labels someone a third gender does not mean such a gender exists in biological reality. It reflects a logically meaningful category, not a scientific one. Comparing all three, Muxes, Hiras, and Fafine, show us that while different societies may recognize social categories outside of the male-female binary, these categories are culturally constructed roles assigned to biological males. None of these systems create or reflect a third sex from a biological perspective. Anthropology allows us to study human belief systems, but studying a belief doesn't mean accepting it as a truth. Just as we study witchcraft among the Asande or ancestral spirits among the Dagara, we can study third gender systems without affirming them as objective realities. As anthropologists, we use cultural relativism to understand how societies define and structure behavior. But we must also use critical relativism to ask how those structures affect individuals and whether they align with universal truth about the human condition. According to the still dominant liberal framework in gender studies and liberal anthropology, sex and gender are fundamentally different concepts. In this view, sex refers solely to the biological attributes such as chromosomes, reproductive organs, and hormone levels that categorize individuals as male or female at birth. Now, according to them, gender, by contrast, is described as a social and cultural construct, obviously constructed by liberals, of course, which means it's imaginary, encompassing the roles, behaviors, identities, and expressions that a given society considers appropriate for men, women, or individuals outside the traditional binary, right? Proponents of this illogical model argue that gender is fluid, self-defined, and not determined by biological sex. They even claim that individuals can identify as a different gender than the one assigned at birth, or even reject the binary altogether, adopting terms like non-binary, genderqueer, or agender. I mean, you can even literally identify as a fluid giraffe if you want. Why not? From this perspective, gender identity is considered deeply personal and valid regardless of anatomy, reality, common sense, and society. It's urged to affirm each person's self-declared gender to avoid committing the terrible crime of misgendering, and of course, to promote inclusion, which is part of the political agendas, to be sure. Which, by the way, sadly, is also a promoted part of curricula in every single college across the United States. However, in contrast to this deeply ideological and ultimately politicized narrative, biological reality does not support the disconnection of gender from sex. Every human being is born either male or female, determined by the presence of XX or XY chromosomes, reproductive organs, and secondary sexual characteristics. This binary biological structure is not a social construct, which is all that liberals can build. No, it is a fundamental feature of human reproduction and biology. Gender roles may differ slightly across cultures, but they are almost always built upon the observable foundation of biological sex, not separate from it. The idea that someone can feel like another gender, feel like a unicorn today, or switch between genders is a subjective experience, not an objective fact. No culture, no matter how tolerant, can override the genetic and anatomical reality of sex. While it is anthropologically valid to study how societies interpret or ritualize gender roles, as is in the case of Muxes or eras, this does not mean those societies have discovered new sexes or genders. It simply means they have assigned cultural specific social meanings to male-bodied individuals behaving in ways atypical of folded sex. Recognizing that fact is not bigotry. It is the foundation of scientific and intellectual integrity. In conclusion, the idea of third genders is a social classification, not a biological one. It is an imaginary social construct promoted by those radical liberal activists who still remain in academia. And the push for artificial social constructs like third gender is not about inclusion or compassion, but about advancing a radical ideological agenda. These synthetic constructs are specifically designed as tools to undermine objective biological truth, destabilize our American traditional family and gender roles, and to erode the moral and cultural foundations of our beautiful country and of the entire Western civilization. By blurring the line between reality and ideology, leftist activists, especially those embedded in academia, seek to re-engineer society, replacing facts with feelings and coercing the public into compliance through language control and social pressure. Ultimately, the goal is to create a fragmented, confused, and dependent population that can be more easily manipulated into embracing state-driven collectivism and identity-based politics, leaving no room for truth, tradition, or individual liberty. Human sex remains binary, male and female, and that binary remains true across all cultures. The town of Osaka is not a special magical place or an imaginary town in the Star Trek saga, nor belongs to a different dimension where the laws of physics and the most basic biological rules don't apply. It's not. However, societies develop symbolic categories, sometimes as adaptive strategies or as expressions of spiritual beliefs that go beyond strict biological rules. Studying those systems help us understand culture, but it doesn't change reality. In anthropology, it is possible and necessary to understand a culture while maintaining a firm grasp on scientific facts. At the end of the day, all that matters is that reality is not optional. And with that, I will wrap this up the American way, rooted in facts, not feelings. Remember, chromosomes don't care about your pronouns, and biology isn't canceled just because some activists posted a video on YouTube. Cultures may invent all sorts of labels, but here in the real world, where bills are paid, borders matter, and men don't get pregnant, we stick with reality. So God bless common sense. God bless our two sexes. And most importantly, God bless the United States of America, the last place on earth where truth still has a fighting chance. Thanks for watching and good night.